All right, how many designers do I have in the audience? How many people define themselves as designers? Some designers, some wavy hands. That's all right, because in one way or another, we are all designers. This is something that I truly believe and is at the center of my work. Hi, my name is Chris. I work at the intersection between technology and social justice. I'm an activist in the areas of AI surveillance, and I work as a product manager for a social startup. As you've heard, my background is in user experience design, and I often talk about inclusive design, accessibility, and all of these topics, which are very important, but today I'm not. Today I'm talking about decolonizing tech. And while we might instantly think about apps, AI, robots even, when we hear tech, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. All right. So, beyond the traditional design, beyond products and services, to take a more strategic approach. And I want to look closer at the concepts and ecosystem in which these technologies and technological commodities are created, which is ultimately shaped by societal norms and circumstances because, as we can see, thinking about society implies thinking about technology and vice versa. Both concepts are not separate objects, but a single reality. But before we start, I'd like to position myself towards this topic, because although I have family in the global south, sprung from a lineage of slavery, I was born here, in Germany, one of the strongest bastions of the global economy. So I'm not speaking from the authority of living in the colonized territory, but from the perspective of a colonizer, even though I've never lived outside of this country, and even though my appearance might lead you to believe otherwise. Not being part of a certain marginalized group should not discourage you from speaking up against injustice. But, and this is my first lesson, positionality is important. Always ask yourself where you stand in regards to the problem that you want to solve and who you want to solve it for. My positioning should bring to your attention that all the information I will give you in the next minutes is biased by my lived experiences and will always be less authentic as when experienced from those directly affected. Now is the question, why did I choose the topic? I chose the topic because we are facing an unprecedented global emergency. Life on Earth is in crisis. We all know about that. Scientists agree. We have entered in a period of abrupt climate breakdown, and we are in the midst of a mass extinction of our own making. And as dire as this sounds, it seems that it's only background noise, overshadowed by the next tech hype cycles and controversies that follow. Another AI said or did something incredibly racist, another social network that helped to grow far-right ideologies instead of building communities, and so on. And it seems that every prominent move tech leaders take towards innovation gets exposed as deeply flawed or a money-making scheme in just 1 or 2 years after release, or just a few days after launch. And when looking at the state of technology and its impact on society, it can be worrisome, right? We're looking at apps, cloud services, AI, those are tools of our digital age. But I'm sure you've heard this many times before, and correctly, that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. It's the gospel I live by. And the good news is that the master's house is not the only house that exists, because there are so many different houses. Not to dismantle, but they show us that there are alternatives, and each one comes with its own toolkit. And the reason why we all experience capitalist realism, the feeling of inescapability from the current system, a system that we all know needs changing before we squander the last chance of survival, is because our house has taken over the world, and it seems like there is no alternative. And even if we are aware of the other houses, it seems like ours is the only one worth considering. And if you're already sick of house metaphors, I'm sorry, this is the backbone of my talk. So, colonialism has shaped this planet, as Europeans have bended to its will. And if we want to course correct and break out of the boundaries of real politics, we need to take decolonization serious. And this is why I acknowledge that decolonization is not a metaphor. This is an argument made by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Young in their article with the same name. And it's an indictment of the very thing that I am doing right now. They argue that decolonization has to be material, insofar that native lands need to be returned to those who has been stolen from, and reparation need to be made. No land acknowledgement, no degree in post-colonial studies, or talk about decolonizing tech is going to achieve this. And it's also important that we are not talking about historical land grabs only, right? The scramble for Africa in the 19th century, which was orchestrated from this very city, that's historical. But we need to talk about the real material consequences of current and emergent technologies. Be it the active civil war in the Congo, which over the past 30 years has cost over 6 million lives. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, yet it provides 70% of the world's cobalt and rare earth needed to build our technology. Something does not seem to add up here. Then the Kenyan people who work in the shadows of OpenAI to sort out the vile filth in the training data for less than $2 an hour, as well as the click workers in the global south who work behind the shiny UI of the latest smart product or in the trenches of cleaning up social networks. And the indigenous people of the Americas whose drinking water is in danger because of lithium mining, the material needed for the batteries of our electric cars, smartphones, and laptops, which also destroys ancestral places of worship. So the Austrian scientists Ulrich Brandt and Markus Wissen call this the imperial mode of living. In their book by the same title, they state that the imperial mode of living implies that people's everyday practices, including individual and societal orientations, as well as identities, rely heavily on the unlimited appropriation of resources. And this is especially true for the very technology we use to try to innovate us out of the mess that we have innovated us into. These, for us in the West, mostly invisible externalities, are the material base that shapes and maintains our society. In a vicious circle, we then decide which technological advances are seen as desirable, which then further informs the exploitation of the material needed to make the next tech revolution happen. Round and round it goes. There are some who say like, yeah, but we have green tech and sustainability, and I think this is important, yes, but then again we are talking about products and service layer. From a strategic design perspective, we could have decided to combat climate change with modernization of public transport, but instead we focus on electrifying individual transport, thus raising the need for more cobalt and lithium, more exploitation. Don Norman, the grandfather of human-centered design, summarizes this as follows. Digital products all run on physical products, and they use an enormous amount of electrical power, often generated by fossil fuels. Digital products, games, and social networks are designed to addict and to destroy the rich cultures of the world to replace them by the hungry greed of Western economics. All right, so now that I've addressed the material importance and the exploitation behind the tech hype cycles, let's get back to the ideology. And it might seem that I'm using the concepts of colonialism interchangeable with capitalism, and so I want to connect some dots briefly. Introducing also the concept of white supremacy to the mix, which is created or was created as an ideology to legitimize the exploitation of non-Europeans during the colonial conquest. It is all part of a system of domination, control, and power. Thus, is active since then and only has evolved. We have an unbroken line from the mercantilism of Christoph Columbus to the late-stage capitalism of today. And this is why we'll mention some aspects of the system of domination, control, and power while talking about the structures of colonialism. So whenever you hear that, I'm not taking a sidestep into other topics, it all connects. So, getting back to our house. The sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos explains that we are facing modern problems for which there are no longer modern solutions. And he's referring to modernism, which is the culmination of hundreds of years of Eurocentric design principles. Think about Bauhaus. So, when we look at modernism's prescription of the world, it reveals yet as another byproduct of white supremacy, centering itself as the end-all approach to universal human aesthetics. And it's this universality, so central to modernism, that limits our imaginations. De Sousa Santos puts it this way: the West has reached the limits of its critical traditions. It has exhausted the possibilities of its epistemologies and systems of knowledge. What he's saying is that not only can't the master's tools dismantle the master's house in which we are, we don't have the right tools and we lost the capability to create them. To regain this capability, we need to interrogate why we have ignored the architects of the other houses and just stripped their ruins for material. Because modernism, in the end, is only a symptom. And I thought, let's use art history to illustrate this point and figure it out. So when talking about art history, it's usually a clear progression from ancient art, something that happened from people drawing stuff at walls and to the ancient Greek or whatever, and then ushering in the golden age of geniuses in the Renaissance. This is where in the West art truly starts. The belief that progress always has a straightforward momentum is very deeply embedded in the Western thought, from the Enlightenment to the Silicon Valley mindset. And if we have like two pictures, on the one side, Raphael from the Renaissance, and on the other side, a contemporary Kalighat-style painting from India. A lot of folks, even artists and designers, will have a clear answer to which of the pictures is objectively better. Visitors of a museum exhibition, they would look at this and say, like, oh, look at how lively these faces, and I really can see myself in them, or whatever. And to the other one, it's like, oh, they're very flat, very simple colors. Possibly my child could do it. Yet, and this is one of the core themes of what I'm talking about, is people in India and all over the world clearly have the knowledge about perspective, measurements, color theory, spatiality. Instead of creating a hierarchy of which art is better, we should ask ourselves why the Calicut artists decided not to try to replicate what their eyes could clearly see, because their eyes are the same as ours. These paintings created around a major center of Hindu worship are in the same tradition as many cultures, past and present, favoring using symbolism and expression of intangible themes over depicting the real world. And I got one example on ancient Egypt wall paintings. Some people seem to be much taller in comparison to others, right? They're tall, they're not tall. Simple. So hierarchical sizing denotes the importance of the depicted figures. Pharaohs and gods, for instance, would be huge, while their servants and slaves would appear tiny. So these folks built the pyramids, and I assume if they wanted to, could have gotten more realistic, photorealistic with their paintings, but that's not the intention. That was not what they wanted to communicate. So every form of this depiction, past or present, is designed by the culture to fit their use, designed for a purpose, often lost to our Western understandings because we rarely care to ask. And here the design educator Dory Tunstall concludes, the story of design is that there are these different modalities of making that have happened in many different places. And if we understand the histories, meanings, and connections to place where they come from, we can make decisions around what it is that we select from these traditions to co-create in many ways our own future traditions on what design is and what making is. And I think that's a very beautiful insight. Ironically, when photography was gaining traction in the 19th century and realism was cheapened by its proliferation, Western artists at the dawn of modernity returned to the abstract, but not on their own. If we zoom in on the catalog front page from the 1936 MoMA exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art, we can see from whom important influences were taken. Conjuring up disputes that we are having today, 90 years later, as a reminder that there is an unbroken continuation from colonial past to colonial present. The European trailblazers stole important parts from their colonial subjects, whose cultures were regarded as savage. To this day, artists like Picasso are regarded as geniuses, while the names of the artisans of the originals are not only forgotten, their names have never been known to us. Their culture is exotic enough to inspire, but not valued enough to be respected. And this is where Dory Tunstall's words are so important, that we need to understand the histories, meanings, and connections to place where they come from. Talking about these places, switching gears a little bit, once I spoke to a Tobagonian Obeah man about his magic. It's a West Indian cultural practice forbidden by the British, until current day actually. And the man told me, amongst other things, very interesting things, that even when a child would criticize him on his rituals, he would listen, since the Orisha could be speaking through this child. And I often think about this, especially when itching to dismiss the input of users during my research. I mean, how humbling it is to accept knowledge from a place when you should be the specialist. But my reluctance has tradition. The paper Child as a metaphor, colonialism, psy-governance, and epistemicide says to be childlike is a metaphor that is used to denigrate, to classify as irrational and incompetent, to dismiss as not being knowledge holders, to justify governance and action on others' behalf, to deem as being animistic, as undeveloped, underdeveloped, or wrongly developed, and hence to subjugate. We can hear this also in the words of the German greatest poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe when he discusses color theory, saying, finally, it's also worth noting that savage nations, uneducated people, and children have a fondness for vivid colors. The anti-racism educator Temio Kuhn calls this mode of domination paternalism. She classifies it as one of the tenets of white supremacy culture. And it's just one of a very long list that I'm not getting into here for time, but I urge you to look it up and study it because it challenges the normality of organizational work, and all entries are important if you want to dismantle a colonial mindset. But now more on paternalism, since I think it's central to the Silicon Valley mindset and ideology. Temio Kuhn provides some details on how it functions. First, we got those holding power, control, decision-making, and define things, standards, perfections, one right way. Those holding power assume that they are qualified and entitled to define standards and the one right way, as well as make decisions for those and in the interest of those without power. And the next one, those holding power often don't think it is important or necessary to understand the viewpoint or experiences of those for whom they are making decisions, often labeling those for whom they are making decisions as unqualified intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, or physically. Our own internalized sense of paternalism is one of the reasons why we can't see the other houses for their worth. This should, whoa, now we are getting there. How did I do that? All right. Okay, speaking about seeing, the archaeologist Vincent Brinkmann was one of the first to examine color on the supposedly white Greek and Roman statues. When asked why no one had noticed this before, he explained, it turns out that our vision is highly subjective. You have to transform your eyes into an objective tool to overcome the strong bias, a tendency to equate white with beauty, taste, and classical ideals, and to see color as strange, sensual, and garish. In short, to overcome white supremacy. The way we trained to see, what to appreciate, is the thing that we need to change. And Toni Morrison asked, what happens to the literary imagination of a black author who at some level is always conscious of representing his race to the readership that sees itself as universal or raceless? Again, the universal. She coined the term white gaze for this force that pushes even black authors to comply to the boundaries of the universal, that disables their capability to think beyond what has positioned as the norm. From this theory, the theory of colonial gaze has been developed. The paternalistic way of viewing those who do not comply with Western standards as lesser. So the first step in design thinking is to empathize with the people you are designing for. This involves understanding their needs, motivations, and pain points through techniques such as user interviews, observations, and empathy mapping. But how can our observations be trusted if we are so deeply biased? Vincent Brinkman suggests transforming your eyes to objective tools, but the notion of objectivity is itself a trap of white supremacy culture. Fortunately, there have always been artists and designers who refuse to accept the colonial gaze. While much indigenous knowledge has been lost, sometimes actively destroyed during the past 500 years and throughout ongoing genocides in the global south, there are still designers, artists, and educators teaching modes of making and thinking that are different from ours. To summarize and to wrap it up, some of my main points here. If we want to decolonize tech and design, we need to remember that capitalism is a successor and can't be decolonized. To truly decolonize tech, we need to find a way to create it outside of this system. Reject universality, embrace plurality. Let's recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the world's problems, no one technology to bind them all. Other houses were created for a reason. Also in the same vein, question dualities. Good, bad, top, down, black, white. Present the world in a framework of simple opposites. It's a very Western framing of things. And we need room for real complexities of our heterogenic world, because not everything, mostly nothing really fits into binary categories. From a strategic perspective, we need to ask ourselves how we might tackle the problems of our times without relying on resources gained through extractivism. And we need to acknowledge the shortcomings of our design education, professional experience, and step away from a paternalistic attitude towards wisdoms we have underestimated and neglected before, to actively challenge our colonial gaze, something that can only truly happen by working together with those affected. The visionary Buckminster Fuller once said, "We cannot change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, we need to build new models that make the old obsolete." I did not come here to sell you the anti-colonial double diamond, diverse design thinking, or indigenous agile. These would be just iterations of the tools that built this house. And as Don Norman recently admitted, human-centered design was a mistake. It should have been humanity-centered design all along. So what I tried to create is curiosity and humility. We have been conditioned to be blind to the wisdom and practices of the global majority. If we want to give humanity a chance to survive the current technological death cult, we need to learn to listen and to make space for those at the workbench who have been previously excluded. For the next houses need to be co-created by all, for all. Thank you for listening.